start to fold. And 30-month old baby broke the looking glaze. Sip on years of bad, good times from your past. And when you believe things that you don't understand, and then you suffer superstition.
Okay, can I just give a thank you to Joe and Ollie who are on the music. You will hear some more of them later on as well. Can I just welcome you to our big questions? This is an evening we do on the third Sunday of each month, where we look at the big questions that people often have sort of in life. What we're going to do is Michael Otts, who's an evangelist, so I shall introduce you in a minute, will come up and do a talk. As he's speaking, there is a number which will be showing upon the slides there. Please, as he is talking, text a question in. At the end of his talk, we'll have a 5-10 minute breaks where you can get some more tea and coffee, and then we'll have a question and answer session. So text the questions in. There'll be an opportunity to write them down. There's some paper and pens at the back. Or you can actually ask. There'll be some roving mics going around the hall where you can just put your hand up and ask a question. This is a chance for you just to think, hang on, I'm not sure what he said on that talk or that part of the talk. I agree with that or I disagree, or what did he really mean by it? As you're going through, just text the question. We're taking a record of them and then we can ask them. The question tonight is, why is God so absent and silent? And this question actually came from our Community Fund Day, which we had in June. And we had a board, and people had an opportunity to say, what question, if God was there, what question would they ask him? What did they want to know from God? And there was a few of these questions around this topic. I think one of them is, why is God an absentee landlord? Or why is God so silent when there's so much horror and suffering in this world? So we've gone for the why is God so distant and absent. Michael, do you want to come up? Right, this is Michael Otts. For those who don't know him, he's actually my boss, so I've got to be very kind to him. Can you just tell people, where have you been? Well, you've been 2 places, I know.
Yeah.
The last 9 days.
Yeah, you booked the flights. So I was just in Malta with the team over the last week. Not primarily to have a holiday, but to be working with the University Bible Group there in Malta. We're putting on a number of events on the campus there, talking about Jesus, engaging, a bit like we're doing tonight with some of these big questions. Of course, it's a nice place to do it because it's so sunny, you can do all the events outside. So that's where we were in the main quadrangle of the university, speaking, and people just kind of passing by and dropping in. So that was Malta, and then just this weekend I was in the Netherlands, speaking at a couple of different conferences on Friday and Saturday, so I got back in yesterday.
And where are you off to next weekend?
And then Norway next weekend.
So Malta, Amsterdam and Norway. Yeah. It can't be a bad
I'm basically
job,
working my way north. So.
But can I just say, it's going to be colder in Norway than it was in Malta.
Yeah,
so take your woolly jumper with you.
Yeah.
Right, I'm going to let Michael just speak on that topic.
Great. Thanks, Gaynor. Well, it's great to have you with us. And if you are here for the first time, or if you don't normally come to Lansdowne for an evening service, then it's great to have you with us, especially as we look at this. And as Gaynor said, I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes. The number will be on the screen almost throughout the talk. So you can text your questions in as we go through. So don't turn your phones off. Make sure they're on, but on silent. And at any point, if you think we've missed the point, or if you think you disagree, or if you think you've got another issue that I haven't addressed, then text your questions in as we go through. But to begin with tonight, I'm actually going to ask Joe to come and join us again, because he's going to sing us another song, a song you may have heard if you listen to the radio and you listen to songs in that way. And he'll explain the song to us as we think about this subject tonight and introduce it. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, this is a song called It's Death by Dignity. I don't know if any of you have heard of Sufjan Stevens before.
It's a really great singer-songwriter, and this is from his album Carrie and Lowell, and it was actually nominated for a Mercury Prize, which is one of the most kind of prestigious accolades that a singer-songwriter artist can be awarded in this country. And Death by Dignity is the first track on this album. This whole album is really searching. It's really revealing, because this songwriter normally writes big concept albums, but for this one he decided to go stripped back. And it was really motivated by the passing of his mother and processing the grief of her passing, but also a bad relationship when she was alive that he had with her, and dealing with the confusion between the two. So this first song is really exploring some of these themes that we're looking at tonight, in view of suffering, and where do we even begin in the face of them. This song is called Death by Dignity. Spirit of my silence, I can't hear you, but I'm afraid to be near you. I don't know where to begin, and I don't know where to begin. Somewhere in the desert, there's a forest, and an acre before us. But I don't know where to begin, and I don't know where to begin again. I lost my strength completely. You'll be near me, tight, old man, with the wind in your hair. Amethyst and flowers on the table. Is it real or a fable? Well, I suppose a friend is a friend, and we all know how this will end. Chimney swift that finds me, be my keeper. Silhouette on the cedar. What is that song you sing for the dead? What is that song you sing for the dead? I see the signal searchlight strike me in the window of my room. Well, I got nothing to prove. Forgive you, mother, I can hear you, and I long to be near you, but every road leads to an end. Yes, every road leads to an end. Your aberration passes through me in the willows, 5 red pens. You never see us again. You never see us again.
Thanks so much, Joe. It's a beautiful and haunting song, isn't it? Reflecting on the loss of his mother, but not just the loss of her life, but the pain of that relationship that was never quite what it was meant to be. Where do we even begin, is that refrain that came through in the song in relation to the suffering of his life. And I guess that is often the question that we would ask as we look at our suffering world. Where do we even begin? As we look at the magnitude of suffering around our world in all sorts of different ways on a daily basis, bombarded we are by the news each day. Where do we begin in trying to comprehend that and respond to it? And where do we begin when we come to the suffering of our own lives? As I speak to you tonight, I guess there are many here for whom suffering is not something on the far side of the world or something that you just read about in the news, but it's something that you've experienced or are experiencing right now. It can be happening to those close to you, or it may be happening to you. Suffering, of course, can be physical, but it can also be emotional. It's not just broken bodies that hurt, but broken hearts that hurt. Where do we even begin in a world of such suffering? Well, one of the ways that some people begin is to say that because of suffering, because of pain, and because of the injustice of our world, there cannot be any kind of God. And they rule God completely out of the picture. Someone who has done that is Richard Dawkins, the famous Oxford professor and atheist. He said this of the world in which we live: the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And actually what Richard Dawkins is saying there is very consistent with his worldview. He says that's just the way the world is. We just live in a world of blind, pitiless indifference. But actually, for me, that highlights the problem with getting rid of God. You see, not only does getting rid of God not get rid of suffering, suffering will still be here, our lives will still be the same. But if you get rid of God, it raises another question. Is that just the way we feel the world is? Blind, pitiless indifference? Do we feel that there is no good and evil? Surely in our hearts we sense that there is something wrong with this world, that it shouldn't just be this way. So the atheistic answer neither gets rid of suffering, but it also raises another question. Why is it that we feel that there is something wrong with this world? And so for most of us, I guess, suffering doesn't make us necessarily disbelieve in the existence of God, but it does make us ask big questions about God. What kind of God looks at this world of suffering and pain and doesn't do anything about it? Someone once put it, they said, look, if God is all powerful and God is all loving, he'd be able to stop suffering, he would want to stop suffering. But there is suffering, so either he's not all powerful or all loving. So it's not that we disbelieve in God, there may be a God, but what kind of God is he in the face of suffering? As the question Gaynor mentioned earlier highlighted, is he just some kind of absentee landlord who doesn't care about the state that his world has fallen into, doesn't answer the responses of his people? Where do we even begin? I guess in the face of suffering, our natural response is to say, God, we want you to intervene. We want you to do something. We want you to sort it out. But actually, it's worth stopping for a second, isn't it, and asking ourselves, what do we really want God to do? If we want God to alleviate or end suffering in the world, how would God do it? How should God do it if you were to be God? Because the reality is that lots of the suffering, much of the suffering in our world isn't caused by God directly, but by people, isn't it? As C.S. Lewis put it, it is people, not God, who invented bombs and racks and whips and torture. People cause suffering. People plant bombs. People start wars. People cause pain and suffering to those closest to them. It's people that do that. And actually, even so-called natural disasters are often exacerbated and made worse, aren't they, by the injustice or the inactivity of people. Why does an earthquake in one country kill thousands, whereas a similar-sized earthquake in another kill less than 10? Because of injustice and inequality. Why do millions die of preventable diseases or simply drinking unclean water when we could do something about it? So when we say we want God to intervene, what do we mean by that? Because if so much suffering in the world is caused by people, are we asking God basically to intervene and override the actions of those different people? Are we asking God basically to say he should stop them? And if that is the case, where should God stop? How far should God go? I mean, I guess most of us wouldn't have a problem if God stopped an ISIS terrorist in his tracks, or even maybe killed them on the way to trying to detonate their bomb. But is that all that God should do? What about others that cause suffering in different ways? Should God always intervene? Should God always stop whenever anyone is about to do anything that could cause hurt or pain or suffering to anyone else? What about when it's your words or mine or our actions that could cause suffering? For they can, can't they? Should he intervene then? And then, of course, you have to ask the question, what kind of world would we live in if God did always intervene and override my choices whenever my choices were about to cause pain to someone else? It'd be a very different kind of world to the one we live in, wouldn't it? Now, of course, not all suffering in the world is directly caused by people. And it would be a mistake, wouldn't it, to suggest that everything that happens is directly linked to the action of an individual. But the Bible does say that because of humanity's rejection of God, because humanity has turned its back on God, the world we live in is broken. It's not the way it once was. It's not the way it should be. We live in a scarred, fragmented, and broken world. And whilst in one sense that is not particularly pleasant news to hear, it is something that, for me at least, makes sense of this world. See, when we look at suffering and pain all around us, something deep in our heart says, it shouldn't be this way. When I stood at the grave of a friend and watched as his coffin was lowered into it, I felt it shouldn't be this way. And you know what? The Bible says, you're right. It shouldn't be this way. This is not, as Richard Dawkins would suggest, just a universe of blind, pitiless indifference where there's no good or evil. There is good and there is evil, and something has gone wrong. It's not meant to be this way. Something has gone badly wrong. So why doesn't God intervene? Well, really, there's just two things I want to say tonight. Firstly, he has. And secondly, he will. He has and he will. Firstly, he has. The question tonight raises the idea that God is distant and absent. And in the midst of suffering, that is often how God can seem. But is that the case? And is that always the case? Elie Wiesel was one of the few survivors of the Auschwitz concentration camp. And in his book, Night, he reflects on his experience in that camp. He reflects on how his experience of horrific suffering caused him to lose his belief in God altogether. And there's a very moving and harrowing scene that he recounts from that time of how he came to lose his faith in God. He's talking about how someone had escaped from the camp, and in punishments, a number of others had been lined up to be executed, to be hung in their place, including a child. And he writes this: "Then came the march past the victims. The two men were no longer alive. Their tongues were hanging out, swollen and bluish. But the third rope was still moving. The child was too light, still breathing. And so he remained for more than half an hour, lingering between life and death, writhing before our eyes. And we were forced to look at him close range. He was still alive when I passed him. His tongue was still red, his eyes were not yet extinguished. Behind me, I heard the same man asking, 'For God's sake, where is God?' And from within me, I heard a voice answer, 'Where is he? This is where, hanging from the gallows.'" Now, Elie Wiesel didn't mean anything more than what he meant exactly in those words, that that's what God was to him, dead, hanging on a gallows. And yet actually, the Christian story tells that he maybe spoke more than he knew. You see, the Christian story tells us that there is a God who did die, quite literally, who did step into this broken world, who did experience brokenness and pain and injustice and suffering and torture and, yes, death, hanging not from gallows but from a Roman cross of crucifixion. See, the Christian story says God is not distant and absent, but the God that we read about in the Bible is a God who did come into this world, who did experience brokenness and pain and suffering firsthand. Actually, a couple of years ago, I was going round Auschwitz myself, and it is a harrowing experience to think of what happened there. But there was one part of that tour that stood out. There's scraped with fingernails into the plaster of one of the cells this crude but clear image of a crucifixion. I don't know the story behind it. But it does, or it did at least for me, remind me that in that place of suffering, the Christian story, the Bible story, tells of a God who stepped into our suffering. Not a God who was distant or absent, but a God who knows what it's like. A God who's experienced it firsthand. You see, when we say, where is God in pain and suffering? Why is God distant and absent? You have to ask the question, which God are you talking about? For the gods of some religions are distant and absent. They cannot understand. But the God revealed in the Bible does know, and he does understand. John Stott was a famous Christian preacher, and in his book, reflecting on Jesus' death on the cross, he writes these words. He said, I could never myself believe in God if it were not for the cross. The only God I believe in is the one Nietzsche ridiculed as God on the cross. In the real world of pain, how could one worship a God who was immune to it? I have entered many Buddhist temples in different Asian countries and stood respectfully before the statue of Buddha, his legs crossed, arms folded, eyes closed, the ghost of a smile playing around his mouth, a remote look on his face, detached from the agonies of the world. But each time after a while, I've had to turn away. And in imagination, I have turned instead to that lonely, twisted, tortured figure on the cross, nails through hands and feet, back lacerated, limbs wrenched, brow bleeding from the thorn pricks, mouth dry and intolerably thirsty, plunged in God-forsaken darkness. That is the God for me. See, the God of the Bible, the God of Christianity, is not a distant, absent God, but a God who knows suffering from the inside. Not one who looks on from above, immune to it, but a God who's experienced it. And I have to say, in the midst of suffering, that does make a difference. Now, you might say, but how does it make a difference? I mean, yes, God can sympathize with me. He understands what it's like. But when we suffer, isn't it true that we want more than just sympathy, but a solution? We don't just want someone who understands, but we want someone who can do something about it. That's why it's really important that the Bible says that Jesus' death on the cross was not just an identification with us in our suffering. He wasn't just saying, I know what it's like, but he was doing more than that. What we read is that God himself was suffering not only with us, but for us. He was taking the ultimate suffering, the eternal suffering that we should deserve for our rejection of God, for the way that we have ruined his world, for the things that we have done. He was taking our place. He was stepping into our shoes. He was taking the ultimate abandonment of God the Father so that we wouldn't have to. See, in the midst of suffering, we often cry, why, God? And that's exactly what Jesus cried as he hung on the cross. For he really was abandoned by his Father, so that we may not have to be, so that we would never have to ultimately be separated from the God that we've so often turned our backs on. This is the God who suffered with us and for us. Now, I have to say, that doesn't, of course, give us all the answers to suffering. It doesn't explain why things happen in our lives the way they do. And it would be glib of me and wrong of me to stand here and say that Christians have answers to all of our questions. We have a framework into which to put our questions, but we don't have answers to every specific question. There are many unknowns that we will never have answers to. But if this is God, a God who was willing to live on this broken world and suffer and experience brokenness for us, if that is true, then although we may never know what the answer is to our questions of suffering, we will know what the answer isn't. And that is that the answer cannot be that God doesn't care. Because if this is true, that God really suffered and died for me, then even though I don't understand quite often why things are happening, I know that this God cares. He loves me. The cross shows it. So why doesn't God intervene? Well, the Bible says he has, but secondly, I'd also want to say this. The Bible says he will. He will. See, we often want God to intervene now, and sometimes, wonderfully, Christians tell testimonies and stories of how God does intervene now in situations, alleviating suffering and bringing change. But the reality is, he doesn't always, does he? People get sick and they don't always get healed. Ultimately, everybody dies. God doesn't always intervene now, but the Bible does say one day he will. See, the Christian story is not simply that Jesus died our death, but also that he rose again. And it says that because Jesus conquered death, coming back from the cold, he gives us hope in the face of death. The Christian hope is not simply that God is one day going to take us off this world to some paradise called heaven, but that one day God is going to restore and transform this world. That he's going to kick out of this world all that causes suffering and pain and transform it into the kind of world that it always should have been and one day will be. The Christian story says the world we live in is not the way it once was, but it also says the world we live in is not the way it one day will be. It's going to be put right. It's not just a spiritual hope or a fluffy hope. It's a real hope and a physical hope. It's the hope of a new world. It's the hope of new bodies. It's the hope of transformation. That's what Jesus offers. And that can give real hope to those who suffer. JONI TADA has spent most of her life in a wheelchair. A diving accident as a teenager has left her a quadriplegic. And yet she, reflecting on her experience of suffering and her faith in Jesus, said this. She said, "I can scarcely believe it. I, with shriveled, bent fingers, atrophied muscles, gnarled knees, and no feeling from the shoulders down, will one day have a new body, light, bright, and clothed in righteousness, powerful and dazzling. Can you imagine the hope this gives to someone spinal cord injured like me, or someone who is cerebral palsied, brain injured, or has multiple sclerosis? Imagine the hope this gives to someone who is manic depressive. No other religion, no other philosophy promises new bodies, hearts, and minds. Only in the gospel of Christ do hurting people find such incredible hope." See, what JONI is saying is God hasn't intervened and healed her now. There were some insensitive people that said to her, "JONI, if you just have enough faith, you can be healed." She hasn't been. She spent her life in a wheelchair. But she knows that she has a hope that goes beyond death. She knows that one day she will have a new body. That is the hope of the resurrection. And she says it's only the hope that comes through Jesus and through what he has done in his resurrection that she can have that. Why doesn't God intervene in our world? He has. He stepped into our suffering, walked in our shoes and felt our pain, and he will. He will one day kick all of the suffering and pain out of this world and make it new. So why doesn't he now? If he can and if he will, why doesn't he now? Well, that very question was a question that's raised actually in one of the books of the New Testament part of the Bible. A writer called Peter raises that very question. He says, is God just somehow forgetful? Does he not care about the suffering of our world? Why doesn't he come and put it right? But then he says this, God is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. See, he says the reason why God hasn't intervened and sorted this world out yet is not because God doesn't care about this world, but precisely because he does. What do I mean by that? If the heart of much of suffering in the world is caused by people, if the heart of the problem is, as one person put, the problem of the heart, then the solution to our world needs to be the transformation of the human hearts. Peter says, actually, if God is going to make a new world, firstly, he needs to make new people to be part of that new world. And so he's giving us the opportunity to come to him, to receive the forgiveness of Jesus, to enter into a relationship with him, and to know the hope of being with him one day. inaction, you might say, is not because he doesn't care, but because he does. He wants us to have an opportunity to respond to him. So before we have a short break and go to questions, my question would be, where will you begin in your response to this question of suffering? And as I said at the beginning, you may respond to suffering by saying, God does not exist. There cannot be a God. And you can turn away in bitterness. But I want to appeal to you. If you do reject the Christian answer to suffering, what answer will you put in its place? What framework will you put into its place that will help you not only understand it, but will make sense when you suffer? Might be you're here and you're saying, well, this is my first time here. I've heard some stuff tonight that's intriguing, but I've got all sorts of questions about how this works, and I'm not sure I understand it. Well, that's okay. It can take time to understand this stuff. That's why we put on lots of stuff here at Lansdowne for you to look into these things, including something called the Alpha Course, which we'll tell you about later. But it may well be that for others, this does, to some degree at least, make sense. And you do start to realize that this might be true. Well, if that's you, then why not come to experience what Jesus can offer you? He wants to offer you not only forgiveness for the past, but hope for the future. And he wants to walk with you through life, through pain, through suffering, and be that present friend. And he can and he will, if you ask him to do that for you. He won't force his way in. But if we ask him to, he is there and wants to walk with us through it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a short break. Joe is going to pop up with Olivier again, and we'll have some more music. There's some tea and there's coffee at the back if you need a top-up on that too. And the number is going to be on the screen. And what I'd love you to do is to text in now, because there's probably all sorts of issues relating to this topic we haven't even touched on yet. And deliberately in 20 minutes, half an hour, you can't try and do that. But that's why we've got time now for you to text your questions and respond to those. So get texting and also get talking to the people next to you. Maybe you've come with someone, why not ask them what they thought of it and what their question might be off the back of it. And we'll also have a roving mic, so if you've not got a phone, then you can ask it from the floor. And we've also got paper and pens, I think, around the building.
Yes. There's paper and pens right at the back next to the tea and coffee. So
Great.
please, if you haven't got
Tom's
a phone, or you don't want to go on a roving mic, just fill the question in there and we'll collect them and we'll add them to it. Also, I was just going to say, I mean, this is quite a personal topic, and some of the questions you may not want to ask publicly. I just want to say there will be time afterwards at the end to come and pray with somebody or to talk to somebody individually at the front here. Okay, so if you don't feel actually this is too personal, then there will be an opportunity at the end to chat to somebody.
Great.
Okay, so start chatting to the person you're sitting next to, grab yourself a tea and coffee, and then we'll come together in about 5 to 7 minutes.
ocean and grew legs and they started walking. And the fish ran over the trees and grew tall and they started talking. And the stars fell out of the sky and the tears roared into the ocean. Now I'm looking for a reason why I even set this world into motion. 'Cause if you're not really here, you don't even matter. Now I feel to the top of fear, 'cause it's all just a bunch of matter. 'Cause if you're not really here, then I don't want to be either. I want to be next to you. Black and gold, black and gold, black and gold. Ba-da-da-da-da. As I look into the night sky, I see 1,000 eyes staring back. And all around these golden beacons, I see nothing but black. I feel the weight of something beyond them. I don't see what I can feel. If vision is the only validation, then most of my life isn't real. 'Cause if you're not really here, then the stars don't even matter. And now I feel to the top of fear, 'cause it's all just a bunch of matter. 'Cause if you're not really here, then I don't want to be either. I want to be next to you. Black and gold, black and gold, black and gold. Da-da-da-da. 'Cause if you're not really here, then I don't want to be either. I want to be next to you. Black and gold, black and gold, black and gold.
Okay, if we can come to our seats now. We have got a few questions that have come in, but as Michael answers the questions, please feel free to either put your hand up if you want to come back to on it, and I'll get a mic to you, or you can text that in. If anybody's got any paper ones they want to hand in, just wave them in the air and Tom will come and collect them. Okay, and then brings them up to the front. Right, there's been quite a few different questions on different angles as people are coming. But one of the questions somebody said is, so it's really about feelings, and probably some of us often feel resentment to people, a dislike to somebody, a jealousy. I mean, and that can eat away in us. So why, when we feel a certain way, and we know we shouldn't, and I think we all feel that at some point to somebody, why doesn't God take that feeling away when we ask?
Yeah, good question. Why doesn't God take our feelings away when we ask him to do that? I guess one thing to say about feelings is they're really difficult, aren't they? They're very changeable. Sometimes our feelings are good and they correspond to truth and to reality, and it's good that we feel that way. sometimes it's good that we feel bad because it's sometimes right and appropriate that we feel bad in certain situations, and conversely, obviously, good in good situations. But sometimes the reality is our feelings don't always match up with truth or reality, and that is really difficult. And I think that can be for different reasons. I think one thing is we live in a broken world, and that brokenness affects us not only physically, but it can affect us emotionally as well, and of course spiritually. And so we've struggled not just with, broken bodies, but sometimes broken hearts and emotions that don't always work the way they should. Just as we said in the talk, God doesn't always intervene and heal people physically when they ask. If I have a physical disability and I ask God to fix that physical problem I have, that doesn't always happen. Doesn't normally happen, you might say. And sometimes we struggle with problems that are not physical but emotional, and God doesn't always just step in and fix the emotions in that way. But I also would want to give some degree of hope, which is the Bible does give us truth, which is unchanging. Feelings can go up and down depending on all sorts of stuff. And building our lives upon those truths can help over time change our feelings as well. And that's the important thing about living the Christian life. Not building your life on changing emotions. There are emotions involved, and there's great joy often in being a Christian. Building it on objective truth. The God who loved you enough to live, die, and rise again for you. The God who offers you promises which you can build your life on, and so on. It's standing on those truths, and then as those truths percolate down into our hearts, over time that can affect and start to change the way we feel about other situations or other people. It doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't mean that it's not a battle at times, but it can start to change that. But don't base our truth on what we feel, but base how we feel on the truth. That would be the way we want to say. Build it on that, and that can be helpful. But that's a very big area that you may want to explore more or talk with someone more about later.
Sometimes on that as well, I would just say on a practical level, that we often feel things, and sometimes we're too frightened to talk about it, aren't we? Or to ask our friends to pray about it, because you don't want to be seen to be feeling like that. And I would say we've got to share it with God, but also it's really good to share it with another Christian.
Absolutely.
So for them to pray for you as well, and I think...
And that's what the Christian community should be. Obviously, we don't kind of bare our soul to everyone all the time, but to have people who you can say how you're feeling to. And what often will surprise you is you find that they might say, oh, me too. And we think that we're the only ones struggling with that particular thing. And we realize, actually, no, we're not. And as we look round, it can seem that everyone else has got everything sorted and they have no struggles, but they do. They just maybe aren't articulating them verbally to everyone else, of course, just as you aren't. But they are, and that's why having people around us that we can share with and talk with can be really helpful.
Yeah, and they can also pray with us as well, which is really useful. This is quite a difficult question, and I've actually been asked this question or something similar this week. And the question somebody is, why does God allow people to die in the prime of their life? And I don't know if people know something, but I mean, I was talking to somebody who has lost their son. They're older. Why did they die in their 20s?
Yeah, and that's, I guess a number of us probably ask that for kind of personal reasons. People who have died, death at any time is horrific, isn't it? Even in old age, there does seem to be still something unnatural and wrong about it. But in the prime of their life, why does that happen? And as I think I said in the talk, I don't think the Bible gives us specific answers. Why did that happen to that person and not to someone else? We don't know. And the Bible doesn't give us exhaustive answers to every question we could ask. It does, though, I think, give us a framework into which we can start to make sense of things a bit more. I think the framework, as I said, is this. The world we live in is not the way it once was. We live in a world that is broken. We live in a world where things are not fair. We live in a world where death is an alien invader. It wasn't meant to be this way. And we also live in a world that's not the way it one day will be. We have a God who has conquered death and offers the assurance of a world that put right and made new in the future. And that's the big framework. So we don't have specific answers. Why did it happen to this person, not this? We don't know. Maybe never will. It may well be that we're just part of this broken world and that's what happens. But the two things we can say is, number one, it is bad. This isn't just the way the world always... No, it's broken, it's wrong. Absolutely. And there is hope. We have someone who has defeated death as well. I guess number 3, we have a God who can walk with us through pain and suffering. God the Father knows what it's like to lose a son. He did for us. And this is a God who understands our pain and can walk with us through it. Not always giving us the answers, but giving us his presence in the midst of it.
Thank you. It's such a difficult topic, isn't it? And I suppose this one it's quite specific, but again, it's probably causing somebody a lot of heartache. What would you say to someone with Alzheimer's who's at the end of their life, whose response to the question, do you believe in God, is, he's never spoken to me?
I guess it's difficult to know exactly what I'd say in that situation, not being in that situation, and obviously we don't have a kind of this is what you say in said situation kind of manual. And of course, one of the terrible things about Alzheimer's and sometimes old age is that people can end up saying things or believing things that maybe they wouldn't have said or believed or thought before. And that's one of the horrible things about it. And I think firstly, I want to say that I think actually God understands that and knows that. And I know a friend of mine really struggled with the loss of her dad. And it was like she said, I lost my dad when he died, but actually I lost him several years before. But actually, I think God knew his heart in the midst of all that. And actually, some of the things that he was saying towards the end of his life were not the things that he would have said and were not expressions of the real him. But to do with the second bit, God has never said anything to me, or God has never spoken. I guess we could say that for all of us, whatever our situation. There are many people who say, well, God's never said anything to me. God doesn't speak. And I think what we'd want to say is, in what sense do you want God to speak? Obviously, God doesn't always speak, very rarely speaks with an audible voice. But actually, the Christian contention is God has spoken. He has spoken in history in the person of Jesus. He has made himself known, and he's shown us through that what he's like. And therefore we can listen to him. That's why we really encourage people to look at the person of Jesus, because we think that as we look at Jesus, we're looking at a God who is wanting to reveal himself and speak to us, a God who understands and knows, a God who wants to be with us. And so God, I think, has spoken and can continue to speak through Jesus to us today. I guess the challenge would be for all of us, whoever we are we willing or wanting to listen to what he has to say? Because there's two sides to it, isn't there? Someone needs to speak, but we also need to be willing to listen to that. And I think we do have a God who does speak and is willing to reveal himself to us. And so if you're in that situation saying, well, God, you're distant and absent, a prayer that even an agnostic could pray could be this: God, I don't know whether you're there, but if you are, please reveal yourself to me. And then something you could do alongside that as an activity would be take one of those accounts of the life of Jesus and actually read it for yourself. And you may find that actually God answers that prayer. But you've got nothing to lose by doing it. So why not do that and see what happens?
Thank you. Has anybody got any questions at all from the audience? If you just want to put your hand up, I've got some mics that can come round.
Yeah.
There's one down the front here, Tom. Thanks.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is JONI. Rather than a question, can I add something, comment on this question?
Okay.
Right?
It's just brief.
Yes.
It's rather
Very
a
briefly,
question,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
The thing is that when people say God is distant and not seen, my answer is that there's a lot of radio waves going around, and we cannot hear, we cannot know. We need a radio to tune in and then increase the volume. Then we know there is radio waves, and then we can hear. Unless we tune into God and ready to listen, you will never see God. But once you do that, you know there is God, and he is also answering. Thank you.
Okay.
Going on from that then, actually, is sort of, you can tune into God. But how do I hear God?
Yeah. How do I hear God? I guess, as we just said, it can be a bit like a radio, couldn't it? It's there, but you've got to tune in and listen to it. And I would say the same is that the Bible says God speaks in many ways. God speaks through the Bible, his words. The Bible says God speaks most clearly and most fully through Jesus, his son. There's a verse in the book of Hebrews in the Bible that says, in the past God spoke through prophets at various times in various ways, but in these last days he's spoken to us through his son. So actually what we want to say is the clearest, the fullest way that God does speak is through Jesus. As we read about him, as we get to know who he is. And that's why at a church like Lansdowne we spend a lot of time studying the Bible and particularly looking at the person of Jesus, because we think that is how God can speak to us today. Now, that's not to say God can't speak in other ways, and God can sometimes speak to people in very specific ways in different situations. But even then, what we want to do is check what God is saying by the Bible. Because actually, if I say, well, God's told me this, and it's something completely contradictory to what the Bible has already said, then I know that actually that's not God. Because I need to check that always by what God has already said clearly to me through the Bible, through Jesus. So actually, that's open to anyone. Anyone can pick up a Bible and read it. That's why we encourage you to take away one of those accounts of the life of Jesus, read it through. But it may also be helpful to do that with someone else, so you can discuss it, you can ask your questions. And that's why, as a church, we look at the Bible together, because we think that as we study it together and help each other, we can hear God speaking to us through it as well.
Yes, and if somebody doesn't even know whether the Bible, they don't believe the Bible exists or is God's word, I would just encourage you, come along on a Monday night to Alpha, where we look at even more basic. And we've got groups, we've got an Alpha course running at the moment on a Monday at 7:30. You'd be more than welcome to come along and ask any questions and really explore what it really means to follow Jesus.
And I think there's probably, on that, there's two ways you could discover whether the Bible is true in the Word of God. One is you can objectively investigate it, look at the evidence for it, work out whether it's historically accurate and everything. You can do that. That's good. Of course, the other is you can read it and have a look for yourself. A good friend of mine was a complete atheist until one day someone tucked a little copy of Luke's Gospel, the accounts of Jesus' life told by Luke, under his windscreen on his car. And he went away, complete atheist, but was a bit bored, had nothing to do, read that book, and without reading anything else, just was absolutely compelled by the Jesus he read of there. And that was really the journey for him, coming to discover God for himself. So that's why we'd say, yes, do the other investigation, of course, but actually look at it for yourself.
And following on from that, I was going to do another question, but actually looking at this one, you say, investigate it. But what about all the other viewpoints? You sort of commented saying that Christian viewpoint is the better option. Does that make your viewpoint true? What about all the other viewpoints and all the other faiths?
Yeah, good question. What about other faiths?
I know we're looking at that next time, but
you
absolutely. Can briefly say it.
Briefly. Actually, I think when it comes to different religions, it's good to ask different questions of those religions. What do they say about different issues of life? What are their answers? And of course, the question of suffering is a really big one, isn't it? How do different religions respond to the question of suffering? And you will get very different answers. A Buddhist might say that suffering is caused by desire. Ultimately, it's just an illusion. We need to get rid of that desire. And the hope within Buddhism would be not a physical new creation, but escape from physicality to nothingness, to nirvana. Or if I was a Muslim, I might say, well, Allah wills everything, and therefore everything that happens in the world is caused directly by the will of Allah. Therefore, I can't ask the question why. It just is. That's what happens. So very different responses to the question of suffering. One philosopher put it this way. They said, in the face of suffering, we naturally ask the question why. But they said, of course, in Buddhism, you shouldn't ask why, because that would show that you're not really enlightened. You need to get rid of that desire for a world that's different. In Islam, you shouldn't ask the question why, because it's just the will of Allah. That's just what happens. But he says at the heart of the Christian message is a God who suffered and died and asked the question why in the midst of that suffering, and encourages us to ask that question too. So I would say there are different answers. I think the thing that, as I quoted from John Stott in the talk, makes me attracted and drawn to the person of Jesus is a God who has experienced suffering firsthand. Now, for some people, that's a big issue. I was chatting to a Muslim this week in Malta, and we had some great conversations together as we talked about God and about faith. But one of their issues is that they felt that God could not suffer. He could not become human. He could not experience pain. God is transcendent. But actually, I'd want to say the thing that makes me attracted to the God of the Bible is that God is big enough to become small. He's not a prisoner of his transcendence, unable to experience our suffering. But in one sense, he was able to lay aside something of his transcendence to step into our broken world in our place and know what it's like. And that is the God for me, the God who suffered with me and for me. So I would say, I think the Christian answer to suffering is an answer which is attractive and beautiful. Also, I want to say, I think it's one that's based on truth. How do you know whether religion is true? Well, it's difficult often because if a religion is based on a philosophy or an idea, it's kind of hard to objectively verify. In one sense, to say that something's true, you'd need to be able to falsify it. But as we said, the Christian hope, the Christian answer is built on Jesus' death and resurrection, an objective historical event. And the invitation, therefore, is to investigate that event, to say, look, did it happen? If it didn't happen, Christianity really has nothing to offer. It's based on an illusion, and it's not worth following, even if it's attractive. If it did happen, if Jesus did live, die, and rise again, then it is worth following, even if it wasn't attractive. But wonderfully, as someone put it, Christianity is not too good to be true. It's so good because it is true. It's based on something that really happened.
Brilliant, thanks for that. And I mean, we are looking at Are All Faiths the Same at the next big questions, which is on the 19th of November. So that was a great trailer.
Good.
So that was good. So slight tangent, but I'm going to ask it because it's been texted in, so it's not quite on suffering. This person actually basically, I'll summarize it, but basically said he feels, or they feel, she feels, God is not silent. But basically, why are Christians so silent in today's society? They're asking, why are Christians not fighting back?
Okay.
So why, I mean, they feel that God is silent, is not silent, but they think that Christians are so silent and too silent. So why do you feel that they are so?
Yeah, I guess that's a good question, isn't it? Because one of the ways that we want to say God then wants to communicate with the world is through people who've already come to know him, that we can speak for him and on behalf. The Bible uses this picture of followers of Jesus being like ambassadors, God's representatives in the world. And so, yeah, Christians should be speaking up. We should be speaking out. I think sometimes people always think, well, Christians should be speaking up against this or against that. We're the world's protesters. But actually, I think the Bible says we're not primarily the world's protesters, we're the world's proclaimers. We've got good news to share, and we want to share that. And we want to be able to communicate that. And we think that good news of a God who loves us and has stepped into our brokenness and offers us a relationship with him, that is the message that can really change lives and ultimately can also change societies. So yes, Christians may get involved in politics. Yes, they may speak out on certain issues. Yes, it's right in a democratic society that Christians can exercise their voice. But I want to say, most of all, Christians should be exercising their voice to say what is at the heart of their faith, which isn't primarily a list of moral codes that people need to live by, but a relationship with the God of the universe, which can transform your life. That's what we want to speak out about. And we should be confident in doing it. It's true, and it's good. And it's what people need.
It was interesting. I was talking to the young people in youth church today about idols, and I think we came to the conclusion, actually, Christ should be at the centre of everything we do. So even if somebody was playing football on a football pitch, the other people and players should know about who that person is and why you're so different.
Yeah.
That, I mean, we shouldn't be silent. We should be speaking out and acting out our faith 24/7, really. And we shouldn't be quiet about it at all. Somebody's put in, which is quite a difficult one, is why do people suffer with their mental health, dark thoughts and depression, etc., which can go on for years and years and years and years?
Yeah. Mental health can be really painful, can't it? Because, you know, if you have a broken body, people can see that, people kind of understand it, but often it's pain that other people can't see or can't understand. Why does that go on unaffected or unchanged? And I think what I would say is that when this world got broken by sin, it wasn't just physical bodies that got broken. Everything about us is broken. All of us are broken, physically, spiritually, and in one sense emotionally and mentally as well. Nothing is quite the way it should be. And for some, that is quite extreme, and there is real pain and scars because of that. And just as I said in answer to one of the earlier questions, the Christian answer is not that God will necessarily always intervene and alleviate all suffering now, whether that is physical or mental. It may well be that we struggle with those things throughout our lives. As JONI TADA's quote says, the hope of the Christian message is for new bodies, hearts, and minds. And wonderfully, that is the hope that we have in the resurrection of Jesus. One day we will be in a world, not only with new bodies that work well, but with minds that aren't so often held captive by things that can really drag us down in that way. So we cannot promise immediate healing to these kind of things. Having said that, though, I would want to say that often understanding the truth of the Christian message of a God who loves you and knows you personally and wants to walk with you through life can not get rid of all mental problems, we won't say that, but it can bring real help and transformation into those situations. Not always instantly, but over time, that can really bring change and help. Because so often some of those problems are caused by basically wrong beliefs or lies that we have about ourselves, about the world around us. What the Christian message does is gives us truth to replace those lies so that we can start to build our lives and build our emotions on those things that are true.
We're not saying that, and I'm just thinking of people I know that have mental illness and just when they become a Christian, that's not going to cure them necessarily, is it?
No, and that's what we want to be really careful in saying, that just as Christianity doesn't guarantee cures to physical illness, so it doesn't guarantee cures to mental illness too.
I think what it does do, it's like Revelations 23 verse 4, isn't it? It gives you that hope that at one point in the future, there's going to be no more pain, no more suffering, no more crying, no more mourning. And I think that's the hope that somebody with mental illness or something can go to, that there will be peace.
Absolutely. And actually that hope also can give you, to some degree, joy, not necessarily happiness, but a real joy, saying, actually, for the Christian, the best is yet to come. It is real. Heaven is not some kind of pipe dream or just some compensation. I love how C.S. Lewis described Earth now in his books. He talks about Earth being the shadowlands. He says, actually, this is just the shadow in comparison to the reality that is yet to come.
We get glimpses, don't we, of heaven shining through. Talked about suffering, you've sort of explained it, but what we sort of haven't said is, how do you explain the disproportionate suffering we see in our world? You did say, there's some countries where we see sort of famine, death at such levels that we don't see in other parts.
Yeah, so we live mercifully in a part of the world where we don't see the kind of suffering that many parts of the world see. Of course, we still see it, and it doesn't make us immune to it. But there are some parts that seem to get horrific suffering. Now, what some preachers like to do on certain television channels is to stand up the minute an earthquake happens in a country or a tsunami happens in somewhere else and say, the reason why this happened is that God was judging those evil people because they weren't believing in God, or they, whatever. And, most of us watch and say, well, no, actually, the reason why the earthquake happened there is because there were plate tectonics that lie underneath the ground, and that's why there was an earthquake, and it wasn't to do with God at all. And so I think we need to be careful, like I said in the talk, not to always try and draw direct links between suffering and natural disasters and, the actions of individuals. What I would say is that sometimes the actions of individuals can exacerbate it, and the inequality of our world means that in some parts of the world people suffer far worse than others. Now, that's not God doing it. I would say that's injustice caused by greed and human injustice, and that's the tragedy of our world. And sometimes there doesn't seem to be any justice in it. There's a psalm in the Old Testament part of the Bible, Psalm 73, where the guy writing it basically asks this question. He says, look, why is it that good people seem to suffer so much? Why is it that bad people seem to have an easy life? Why is it so unfair? And he says, when he looked at it from the human perspective of now, it just is unfair. And that is reality, isn't it? If this is all there is, and if death is the end, life is very, very unfair. But then he gets to the end and he says, but then I looked at it from a different perspective. And I saw actually that this life is not all there is. There is more to come. And actually there is a God who will make things fair, and there will be a day of justice. And that's what we'd hold on to. Wonderfully, this isn't the end of the story. It's midway through the story, and there's another chapter yet to be written.
Absolutely. Does anybody want, I've got one more question. Does anybody else want to ask a question from the room at all? Wave at me if you do. Great, they all want another
Okay.
cup of tea and piece of cake, I reckon.
Okay.
This really, you could redo your talk on this one, but, but actually it's quite a good one because you could actually summarise and conclude your talk. Basically it says 2,000 years and no sign of Jesus coming back. None of us in our lifetime will experience anything of God with our five senses. I don't know if you agree with that. Where is he today?
Where is God today? Well, I guess to take the first part of the question first. 2,000 years have gone by, Jesus hasn't returned. The promise that Jesus made is that just as he went back to heaven, he will come again. He will sort this world out. Hasn't happened. So people say, well, it's not going to happen. Well, of course, if it had happened, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about it, would we, in this kind of way? And Jesus says it's going to happen once. So in one sense, it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It just means it hasn't happened yet. And Jesus says if you want to know whether it is going to happen, go back, or the Bible says, go back to what happened in the past. The resurrection is that claim that Christianity is built upon. If Jesus rose from the dead, this is true, and we know what's going to happen in the future. The future hope is linked to the past events. So just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And actually, that verse that I quoted from the book of Peter in the Bible anticipates that people will ask that very question and say, look, it hasn't happened yet, it's never going to happen. And he says, don't be fooled. It will, and it will happen. And in one sense, because it's going to happen, we need to ask, am I ready for that? But to answer the second part of the question, so here we are 2,000 years later, we can't see God, we can't touch God, we can't hear him audibly with our ears. And that's true. The reality is that we can't. Although the Christian claim is that if you had lived 2,000 years ago, you could have done. That God did make himself clearly known and knowable. And so although we cannot see Jesus physically or hear him audibly with our ears, it doesn't mean we can't know objectively what happened or who he is. That's why we'd say, look at the person of Jesus, investigate him, check him out. At the end of John's gospel, there's a guy called Thomas. Thomas is a kind of skeptic, a doubter. He doesn't believe in the resurrection until Jesus appears to him. And then Thomas says to Jesus, my Lord and my God. It's this great profession of his faith. But then Jesus says to Thomas, he says, you believe me because you've seen. More blessed are those who haven't seen me and yet have believed. And some people take that and they say, well, Jesus is commending irrational faith. But he's not commending irrational faith. He's saying, more blessed not are those who haven't thought and believed, but those who haven't seen me and believed. And then the very next verse of John's gospel, John writes this, he says, and these things are written so that you can believe. So in other words, Thomas got to see physically with his eyes Jesus. We can't. But John wrote it down in a book so that we can understand what Thomas understood. And so it's not that our faith is blind and irrational. It's based on objective truth. We can know it for sure. But also we'd want to say our faith is not just a cerebral historical investigation. Jesus' promise was that it was better for him to go away than for him to stay. Now, why was that? We might think it would be better for Jesus to still be here because then we could see him and touch him. But of course, if Jesus was here in the world today, he could only be in one place at once. If he was in Bournemouth, he couldn't be in Birmingham. And if he was in Birmingham, he couldn't be in Bournemouth and so on. But Jesus said, actually, if I go away, I'm going to send my unseen self, my Holy Spirit, instead. So the Christian hope is those who come to follow Jesus get to experience God himself, by his Spirit, coming into their lives, walking with them through life. And he's not limited to one place or one time. He can be with me in one place while he's with you somewhere else. So the Christian experience is that God is with them. We don't hear him audibly. We don't see him physically. But we do experience his presence. We do experience him walking with us through life, changing us, transforming us, and so on. And then wonderfully, one day, the Bible says, we will see him. And there's a lovely verse in the Bible where it says, though you haven't seen him now, you love him and are filled with an inexpressible joy. This idea that we have this faith, it's based on truth. We don't see him yet, but one day we will. We have joy now, and it's great, but one day we'll have even more when we see him face to face.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michael, for that.
Great.
I think
Thank
that's
you.
sort of finished our questions. We managed to answer all of them, I think. Whether we answered them or not, Michael is going to be around, so please feel free to come up and chat to him if you want a fuller explanation of something he said. There will be other people around if you want somebody to pray with you, or if you just want to chat through something about what you've heard or you're struggling with. There will be people around just round by the prayer barrier. Tea, cake, coffee, still lots more, I think, in the back room. If you've got more questions or you want to explore what it means to follow Jesus more, please feel free to come along to Alpha. It's a friendly bunch. We have a lovely meal at 7:30, and then we go into groups. We'd be more than happy to see you there. 19th of November. Are all face the same? Same place, same time. Okay, there'll be a different speaker, but we're looking at are all face the same. We've also got 3 of Michael's books. Is there one specific book, if somebody was looking at suffering, that they should look at? I should know, but I'm going to ask you.
That's all right. My mic back on. There's 2 books that you might be interested in. One, What Kind of God, has a chapter on this kind of question that we've looked at, so you could read that, and it'll have a bit more detail. The other book I mentioned is the book called What Kind of Hope, and that really looks at what is the hope that the Christian message offers in the face of a broken world. How can we know it's true, and how does that make sense? So if you want a kind of whole book that explores this topic in more detail, that would be the one to go for.
Yeah, great. So they're at the back in the hall. They're £5. If you haven't brought any money with you, I will accept an IOU. Okay. So thank you for coming this evening, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and hope it's answered some questions. Joe and Ollie are going to just play some music as we go out.